Hello there. So recently we released an alternative starter file for poses. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to take a look at that and actually use it. So IMVU, where's the original one? Right, so Blender 2.8, you will need Blender 2.81 to use this file, the new version. It may open in Blender 2.80 if that is being used, but it may very well cause problems, particularly with the animation stuff. So if you're going to use this file, you'll need to use 2.81. Right, so the original one, which I'll drop in this open. So this is the original pose file. Now, if you're new to creating content for IMVU generally, and particularly new to creating poses, you won't know about the long storied history about why the skeleton for the avatar looks like this. The bones are just pointing all over the place, which makes it incredibly confusing to use. So only the most hardened, die-hard masochist, shall we say, will dare use this file. But this is the only way to produce valid, well, using Blender at least, valid poses that will work in IMVU without any issues. And the bones point all over the place because of IMVU. This has got nothing to do with Blender. So the reason why that is because IMVU uses a skeletal system that uses a different cardinal orientation than Blender. And what that means is that when you look at a skeleton in 3D Studio Max, which is what the IMVU content is sourced from, the original content was built using 3D Studio Max, the cardinal orientation is, do I still have, yes I do. So by that we're talking about the axes of orientation that each bone has. So what is it? Z, X, and Y. So let's say, for the sake of argument, a typical orientation of something is like this. So Z or Z points up, down, X is front to back, and Y is left to right. In 3D Studio Max, it's the same cardinal axis may have Z, X, and Y. So whilst the Y axis points in the same direction, the X and the Z have been swapped around. So when you import something that was made in Max into Blender, let's say for the sake of argument, the axes are all wrong, which basically means that the bones point in an orientation that's valid for 3D Studio Max or IMVU, but not necessarily for Blender. So in order to make a functional pose, the bones have to point the way that they do in order for that to be exportable to FBX and then importable and assembled as a functional action in IMVU. So from a usage point of view, that makes this very difficult to use because the bones don't point where they would be expected to. So for example, the common, just grab that one. What people are oh, it's doing that thing again, hang on. So general, reload the file, and then do that. No, it's still doing it. Not sure what that graphics glitch is, but generally speaking, this is what should be expected. But this is the clothing file. You can't use the clothing file for poses because the bones are orientated correctly. What's that? Oh, the bones are orientated correctly relative to Blender and what would the word be? They're orientated relative to Blender for the production of a Blender appropriate skeleton, but this does not work in IMVU. So if you export a pose using this skeleton, it'll be non-functional in IMVU. It'll explode. Oh, that's why it's doing that. It'll explode all over the place in IMVU. So what we've been needing is a skeleton that looks like this, but functions like this. So we need the bones to be actually physically orientated, pointing all over the place, but we want the thing to appear from a user-friendly point of view like this. The only way that we can do that is to use something called mesh proxies, and that's what we've done. And where is it? So this is now the alternative pose file. That's in pose mode. So in object mode, it looks like a normal skeleton, how we would expect it to appear. But now where is this? Right, so if we disable, let's get a bit closer, whoops, get a little bit closer to this. If we disable the use of what are called shapes, IMVU calls them shapes, but they are mesh proxies, and we'll see that in a second. Disable that, and then we can see all the bones. So all the bones point in the proper directions that they should point in, but for usability point of view, we can enable shapes. That's in object data properties for the skeleton, I think. Is that one that? Yeah, object data properties for the armature. So we disable those, the bones point in the right direction, enable shapes, and we have a skeleton that's usable from an end user's point of view. So this means that we can start posing this relative to what we're expecting much more easily, particularly with the fingers, when we get to the fingers, because with the old version, come on, catch up. With the old version, it's difficult to determine which bone is controlling which element of the mesh. So that's that one. But on this same finger, we can see that we have bones pointing in completely different directions. It's the same finger, and this happens to all of them, and that makes it difficult to pose. So with the new file, we've essentially eliminated that. So now we're just dealing with boxes. But it functions the same way. So we have to select the armature. Whoops. Select the armature, make sure that we're in pose mode, and then we can just pose. So let's make a... oh, colors. Yeah, so the colors forgot to mention that. The colours are just visual aid. So the red ones, they represent just the main torso bones. So all the main bones of the torso. Black represent bones that shouldn't be animated. You can have keyframes, but they shouldn't move from where they're located, because those are what IMVU use as root elements of the skeleton, so it knows where the skeleton is relative to the world. And then we've got light and dark green for the hands. This just separates them and makes them easy to distinguish in the action editor. So we've got two bones selected here, one on the left and one on the right, but they show up as different colours. This makes it immediately clear which bones are selected and what hand they're associated with. Same with the red, so if we select all of them, we can see all the colours in the action editor. So we know what bones we're dealing with just glancing at the editor. So let's make a pose. Let's do a plank. So what are we on in local? That's okay. Local orientation means that the bone is manipulating itself relative to its own axes. View. Twist. Twist. So we're going to make a, going to make a plank pose. So we're just selecting the bone that represents, or the mesh object that, whoops-a-daisy, represents the bone that we're actually wanting to select. So remember that underlying all of this are the actual bones. So rather than trying to select some of these tiny ones, or some of these more confusing ones in the hands, we're using shapes and we're dealing with a more consistent appearing skeleton. Oops. So what you want to do, or what you want to be mindful of, if you have to twist the legs or the arms, use the shoulder bone or the hips, because the bicep, not the bicep, the thigh and bicep bones just they twist as opposed to twist and rotate like a ball and socket. So you have to be mindful of that when you're doing your pose to make sure the mesh doesn't collapse on itself. So there is a plank. And of course, to make this a static pose for IMVU exported using the FBX format, we have to duplicate this. So we need to select everything, pose, copy, whoops, make sure we're on the right keyframe, pose, copy, pose, paste. So that creates a limited duration that's needed, and then we need to reset this. So pose, making sure everything is selected again, all, pose, clear transform, all. And this is needed for FBX. This last section from frame 5 to 10 isn't part of the animation. All it does is essentially tell IMVU that the FBX contains some animation or some motion of some kind. Otherwise, it'll not import the file properly. So that's a T-pose, that's what we start from. There are a couple of examples. So T-pose, so we can rename this. We can duplicate it, rename plank. One.pose. Let's make another one using this, an animated one. So duplicate, pose 2, and let's animate this so we can get rid of that reset on frame 10 because we don't need this as it's an animated pose. So select all of those, that's Alt right click or Alt left click depending on which button you've got set up as your selection option, and just delete. And what we've got is an end and a start, or a start and an end. So Alt click, press the G key and just move those maybe all the way up to frame 60, so that's 2 seconds. And in the middle, so set the timeline scrubber to frame 30, and let's do something else with this. Whoops. Can hear the annoying gym music right now. Arch that back. Stretch it out. Oh no, we want the pelvis. Need to rotate the pelvis. So what we need to do is check our position. So, going to select the wrist bone or hand bone. Going to move so where's the menu thingy for that? Oh, there it is. Snap. We want cursor to selected. Right, so that gives us an approximate position of where the hands currently are. Frame 30. Need to rotate. Need to do the same for the feet. Shortcut for that is Shift S. And they won't be exact because for Blender users we don't have the same sort of controls over the skeleton as Max users. And that is close enough. So there we have another sequence. Well, that's an animation, an animated pose. So this doesn't need the reset pose because it's actually animated. Only the static poses need that. So let's just save this, save as. So if we select all the bones, we can see that we've got a duration now of 60 frames, which is about 2 seconds. So that's our first pose. Oh, and also when you create multiple poses within the same file or multiple sequences, make sure to activate this shield icon. That enables a user control. So this object or this action sequence now has a user. So if we select plank 1, that doesn't have it. Oh, it does have a. Yeah, no, so we want to do a fake user on that to ensure that Blender, which is indicated by the F, that means the data will be kept in the file when it's closed. So that's a static pose, which needs to reset. And that's an animated pose that doesn't. So all we've done is selected individual bones, all the red and green ones basically. We don't generally touch the black one. That's female master root. That doesn't move, or it shouldn't animate. So if you want your pose to actually move from the spot where it is by default, you animate the pelvis bone, not female master root. So with those, we should now be able to export that. So let's just save that again, save as, so we're saving over. Right, and then to export, File, Export, FBX. That brings up the file browser as a pop-up window now for 2.8 and beyond, I guess. So for animation sequences, we need to make sure that the bake animation settings are set properly. So we need to disable NLA strips and force start and end keying. So disable those two. Then in armature, always disable add leaf bones. Geometry, apply modifiers, that can be left as is, it doesn't do anything. But also make sure selected objects is disabled or deactivated. So we've got a file name, got a location, and then just export. Export FBX. So what we can do now in IMVU, create mode, and we need to make a note of this. Generally speaking, you always want to derive from 10,945,930, and that is the empty mood. And we derive from this because it's an item that is stripped of all the underlying avatar sequences. So unless you are overriding the avatar's defaults, the animations and actions that we see the avatar do when it's just sitting or standing in a scene, always use the empty mood. So that's 10,945,930. So there is the avatar, stripped of its default animations apart from the blinking and the head movement stuff. That's morph related animation. So it's in the T pose. So FBX import, load FBX. We need to find the file which we called exercise Twitch. Open. So we'll get this select skeleton root dialog. It's always going to be the one with fewer bones, and generally it should start with female 03 master root, and it'll do that for both the male and female avatar. So there is a male and female version of this alternative pose file. So select that. We've got our avatar mesh, so we always know that that's correct. Import. And for this, we only need the pose data, so we can deselect avatar.mesh. We don't need that, and it'll automatically deselect all the materials because we don't need those either. And all we want are our poses. I think we're missing one, but we'll see. Apply scale 0.01 and then import. Success, import changes, and then apply changes, and then we create our action. So action tab, add. We're just going to do stance dot idle for this. It's an avatar related pose or product. Play the same ensemble. We can select our pose. Leave that for now. Loops 0. Those two can be left okay. And there we have our pose, which looks a bit, oh, the arm's gone a bit wonky. Yeah, that looks rather suggestive, but that's what you get for, that's what this T-pose is. Right, so that's a T-pose, which is the static pose, and it's switching between the static pose and the reset. So for those, we need to set a frame range 2, 3. So that's loop start and loop end, and that's our static pose. Planking. So all you need to do then is save that and then upload to the catalogue. What you may also need to do in the config tab is set whether this is for male or female and or. So that's male or female avatar. So that's 80 for female, comma 191 for male. Apply changes. And in fact you can use this. So we've got the female showing at the moment. It'll switch to the male. So the skeleton will work for both male and female avatar. You don't necessarily need to use male for the male poses or female for female poses. So that's the new alternative pose starter file. So let's do another pose. I'm going to start with the T pose. Oh, that's why I did that. So let's get rid of these. Delete. Delete. And we can still use this reset stuff. Just clear that out just to make sure. So select all the bones. Pose, clear transform, all. Let's make a wall push-up. So we want the arms to be outstretched. And what you want to do when you're doing poses like that is don't do this. So we want the arms to be outstretched. Don't select the shoulder bone and just move that all the way into position, because it'll cause the mesh to pinch, and it'll do that in IMVU. So as your own skeleton does this, you can't raise your arm in front of you without, well, in this instance it's the clavicle that controls the shoulder blade and that part of the torso, and that rotates that upper section of the torso and stops the mesh from collapsing. That's a mummy pose. Hands, rotate. So this is what you would do against a flat surface like a wall. So hands out in front of you. So the wall would be here. Then we need to set this at frame 60, so we click drag or just click at frame 60. So that's our start pose at frame 1. Frame 60 is our end pose. What we want for this is, again, because we don't have the same sort of controls that 3D Studio Max users have, so we need to move the, so Shift F, S, Shift S, move the cursor to the hand bone. This gives us a point of reference. Because what we're going to do now is rotate the torso . This gives us a rough, probably a bit too much because you'll be head banging the wall. Select shoulders. Let's just test that. And quite quickly we've got a pose. In fact, what we need to do is select all the bones, select all, Alt click at frame 60, so we're grabbing whatever keyframes are marked in the action editor. What we need to do is press the G key, move those to frame 30, because we need the frame or the pose that's at frame 1, we need that to be at frame 60 so that we have a return. So we can, once we're done with the initial pose, well actually let's just do that now. So Alt right click to select that row of keyframes. So it just selects all of those. Pose, copy, go to frame 60, pose, paste. So now we have a pose that cycles. But let's continue. Because although we have our keyframe at 1 and at 30, as we transition, or as Blender transitions, we can see that this point is moving forward from that point. We don't want that, so we're going to have to adjust the pose. Whoops. So in order to get to that target, we can't just rotate that bone up. What we often have to do is rotate the shoulder and the upper arm back so that we can then rotate this forearm up so that this target point, which is the hand bone, latches on to the cursor, which is our actual target reference point. Because again, we don't have the controls that Max users have. And it'll be same on the other side as well. So that's slightly better. So if we go into I'll select these bones at the front. So this is the left arm, and we can see in the background we have the right arm. So they kind of start off in a similar position, but the left arm doesn't deviate as much now as the right arm. So we now have to fix the right arm. So select the hand bone, Shift S, cursor. What frame was that? 15? Yes, 15. So again, rotate the shoulder down to bring the hand up. And we do that keeping in mind as well that the IMVU skeletons are not symmetrical. So that's our start point. So what we have to do is adjust the bones and the bone chain so that we're on that target as best as possible. So we can see the difference in terms of what the right hand is doing versus what the, well, right hand and arm versus the left hand and arm. Whoops. It doesn't really need to be exact. So what we're doing there is just clicking the keyframe to move the marker to those particular keyframes, and then that's in a position to left click dragging so that we get the transition. So we now need to sort out the left hand. Shift S, create our target. If the bones move too fast when manipulating them, hold down the Shift key and that'll slow them down. Let's check the feet. Shift S. And we're going to get some movement on this because got to be careful not to interrupt the upper half of the mesh, of the avatar. Whoops, should have done that on frame 30. So we can grab those, Alt, click to grab any, just to make sure that we're grabbing any other bones that may be in. Move that to 30, do the same thing for the other side. So we don't need to keep deleting keyframes if they are useful. So grab and just move that to 30. So that is another pose. And again, don't animate the black bones. Don't need those. So that is our pose with our keyframes. So that's our wall plank. So let's save that. Save as. Save over. No, let's save as. Save as. Two. So double check. So we should be able to export that as well now. So save that, save again, and then deselect everything. Go into pose mode, object mode. Just have to do this just to double check. File, export, FBX. Make sure settings are set. That's disabled. That's okay, that's okay. Armature, add leaf bones disabled. Let's call this 2. Export. IMVU, create. And again, derived from 10,945,000. Whoops. 45,930. Import FBX, load FBX, exercise 2, open, female 03 master root, 87 bows, as always, select that, and confirmation, as before, you'll get a single avatar mesh instead of like all of this. We don't need all of that. Deselect avatar mesh, we don't need that. That's odd. Oh yes, it has brought it in, so there it is. Sometimes the export script doesn't import the animations properly. So when that happens, the best option is to make sure that the armature is in object mode. So when it's in pose mode, if you were using the alternative file, when it's in pose mode, the colored bones will be exposed or will be visible. When it's in object mode, it'll just go grey. But we then also have to make sure that nothing is selected. So select none and then export. And doing that seems to force IMVU to pick up on the fact that there is animation data included in the file and that there are a number of sequences. Right, so it's got the sequences. Make sure scale is 0.01 and then import. Success. Set up our action. Stance dot idle avatar, same ensemble, and we want wall 0 loops, and then just apply changes. And if that looks like it's a bit wonky, so let's replace. So we might have to check that, but that's imported the pose. And it's basically doing what it should be doing. So let's go back into here, see what's going on there. So select them all, copy that, copy, paste, and frame 60. So everything is the same. So at frame 15, we've got a pose from another need to make that look a little less. Whoops. Right, so frame 15, what we want to do is insert a keyframe for all the bones that are in the skeleton. So we've selected everything, select all, and then from pose, where's insert gone? Oh, there it is, animation, insert keyframe. So pose, animation, and then insert keyframe. We want lock, rot, location, rotation. We can't use scale. Do the same thing for frame 30. Again, make sure all the bones are selected. And then pose, animation, insert keyframe, lock, rot. Because what can happen is that if there isn't any pose data specifically associated with a particular bone, IMVU will use the default pose that's associated with that bone. Need to double check something as well, because it can be tricky to figure out how the animation is actually working, because without an object in the scene as a reference point, as a fixed reference point, it can often be difficult to determine how the animation is actually animating. So drop a chair or something. In this instance, we've got a specific three-dimensional axis widget. So we need to make sure the first frame and the last frame are exactly the same. So pose, copy, paste. So that arm's going a bit wonky at frame 40. So using our target object, cursor, we can shoulder So depending on how accurate you want your pose to be, you can find yourself doing quite a lot of fiddling around. But for purposes of IMVU, it can be quite, the poses can be relatively imprecise. But not too much. So let's do the left hand. Shift S, target. So 45. And that fixes that to a degree. Obviously, depending on how much time you want to spend on these poses, that'll determine how accurate you want your poses to be. So there we go, that should work fine now. So save that, save, exit pose mode, deselect everything, so none, and then just save over again, and then export. So export FBX to, that's okay, that's okay. So again, we are disabling NLA strips, force, and these are important for animation, so make sure those two are always disabled. And then export, create a new project, 10,945,930. So FBX import, load FBX, load in number 2 again, female O3 master root. Don't need the avatar. Apply scale 0.01. And we've got our sequences. It's fine. Import. Import changes. Apply changes. Actions. Stop idle. Hopefully this should have fixed the shoulders, but may not have. Plank wall pose. Oh, I see what's going on there. Loops 0. Let's just do a apply changes. So there's an issue with what looks like the clavicle bones. So this is going to be one of those instances where, let's add this is going to be one of those instances where we're going to have to do quite a lot of trial and error to fix what's going on with the shoulders and the clavicle, because obviously the hands should be up here somewhere, but they're not. Place. So although that one's worked out fine, and the animated version of that which was that one. Oh, I wonder if... Oh no, that's why. So the shoulders are going a bit iffy, but that was working before, so it's likely that this could be IMVU's notorious caching problem. So let's save this. Close it. Close that. Close create mode and reopen them. Let's see if that's fixed it, because sometimes no, it hasn't. Sometimes for whatever reason IMVU doesn't clear its cache properly, and it will reference an old file, or something happens to the data. So when it's imported, the file has to be closed in order for it to rebuild the cache, its internal cache. But this is something different now. So when things like this happen, it means doing a lot of trial and error. And as that can take time, we won't do that now. But so this was just to show the use of the new pose file, alternative pose file. That might be although it shouldn't do that. It might be a question of having to reset. Yeah, because if we look at that, compared to what IMVU is doing, it's the clavicle bones. So there's something So if we look at the angle of the arm versus what's going on in IMVU, in Blender, may be that that we'll find this with particular bones. I think it's like this with the actual, the default, the original, that if you mess around with certain bones, the clavicle in this instance, IMVU doesn't reflect the changes properly for whatever reason. So it may be a question of a bit of trial and error with some of the poses. So in this instance, let's rely solely on the shoulder bone on this half of the mesh. Yes, see, because we cleared the clavicle on this side of the mesh, reset it. So let's try resetting it completely. And what we'll do is use the shoulder bone as our rotation. Don't particularly like doing it this way because it tends to make the mesh collapse. And then to ensure that the copy pose, paste, and this ensures that the start and end poses or bone positions are the same. So on the left side, so the avatar's left, on the left we've got a reset clavicle bone. On the right we've got our positioned clavicle. So let's try exporting that. So save. Right, so let's try exporting this. FBX, we want this to be a different file. 3. That's okay, that's okay, that's okay. Export FBX. Create new, so that's 10,945,930. Import, load FBX. This is number 3. Configure 0.01. Don't need that. We've got all our sequences. And import. Import changes, apply changes, action add, stance.idle, type avatar, same ensemble, plank wall, loops 0. And what we should see, if this is correct, what we should see is the arm on the left is positioned or animates correctly, whereas the arm on the right won't or doesn't. So let's do that. Yes, it does. So it's the clavicle bone. So we're going to have to watch out for that in certain poses. It probably won't do it for all poses or animations or sequences, but when things like that happen, I'm going to have to watch out for that. And it does this with the default pose file, so it's got nothing to do necessarily with the fact that this is the alternative pose file and it's a new version. It does this with the old version as well. So we know that that's the problem, so we can correct it on the right hand side. So we need to reset that. Reset. So what we're doing there, the shortcut for that, where is it? Clear transform all. So what we're doing here is clearing the rotation. That's Alt R. Alt R. And then Alt R. And then of course we have to go back to adjusting the shoulder bone. So Control 3, it's the left hand side. So copy that selected bone, paste, that's the end and start the same. So now we can do, whoops, there are other keyframes. Maybe do a bit of tweaking whilst we're here. Doesn't do any harm. Whoops. So exporting this now. So let's save that. Save as number 4. And this is another reason for version saving your files, because what you can do is make adjustments to one, save it as another version, so that you have a comparison to go back to. So you have actual data that you can load up. Number 4. Then we can export this, object mode, deselect. Export FBX 4, double check, whoops, yeah, export, and then IMVU, create, derive, 10,945,930. Import FBX, load, this is number 4, open, female O3 master root again, 1 mesh, apply scale 0.01, deselect the avatar, deselects all the materials, it's brought in our our sequences, and then import changes, apply changes, and if this has fixed it, what we should find is that both shoulders, so stance.idle, both shoulders should zero for infinite looping. Yeah, they're now in place. So let's drop in our reference point. And there is our sequence. So of course you can go back to this and fiddle around with it, spend as much time as you want, because that arm's going a bit wonky there, which you wouldn't do if you were doing your wall planking. In fact, why is she doing that? Suppose. Select the target. So that's moving the cursor. Oh, that's why. Yeah, so because we lost the control that was provided by the clavicle, we have to adjust the shoulder now to compensate, so it doesn't look as though she's waving at the wall. So if you move the mouse over the colored loops so they highlight, it'll move or rotate in that particular axis. If you move the mouse over the white loop, it rotates perpendicular to the view, the scene. But if you move the mouse over anywhere in between, you get this pale area that's probably just about visible in the stream. That moves on multiple axes. So sometimes you want to rotate on a fixed axis, whereas other times you want to rotate on multiples. So it goes a bit wonky there, so we might need to put a keyframe at 20. Let's put one at 10 as well. See if we can't. But you can see how the more adjustments you make of one bone, the more you tend to have to do of another to compensate for the movement that occurs. So dropping the use of the clavicles now means that we have to adjust a couple more bones. And again, you can be as precise as time allows, essentially. So let's set the cursor there so we can get an approximate position for the hand. Do the same on the other side. Doesn't matter what finger it is because the hand doesn't really move for this particular sequence. Aha, we might have to do some adjustment to that as well. Okay, so change the target. So again, we're shifting the cursor so that we're focusing on the hand bone. Whoops. And again, this is because we lost the use of using the clavicle for this particular pose. Right, so fix the target, select the bone we actually want to move, and then we can make some adjustments to that so that it approximately positions itself where it needs to be. Ah, so that's not the same, so copy that, paste, yeah, that'll do. It's not super duper perfect because it's going to be determined by how much time you want to spend fiddling and tweaking poses. So let's save that as 5, save as. And let's export that. This will be the final export, and then we'll call it quits here, because otherwise it can be quite what's the word? Tedious, monotonous, fiddly. Select none. Export FBX, and this is number 5. Check settings again. Yep. Export. So one more time. 10,945,930. FBX import. Load FBX. Number 5. Female master root. So we want scale 0.01. Deselect avatar mesh, deselect materials. We've got our poses, animation sequences, and then import. Import changes. Apply. So we set up our action. Stance.idle. Avatar. Same ensemble. Wall pose. Loops 0 for infinite. And then apply changes. Yeah, so that's better. Hand isn't going all over the place. So let's load in our reference object. So there is our animated pose with using the alternative starter file. So there we go. So the alternative file is available for alternative pose starter file. It's available for both the male and the female avatar, and it functions exactly the same for both of them. But you may not need to necessarily use the specific file for the specific avatar, but it depends on what animation sequence you're doing. Because the difference between the avatars is not the skeleton, it's the position of the meshes. I think the female head is in a slightly different position to the male head, so if you were doing a sequence that had the avatars kissing or knocking foreheads, you might find that you will have to use the specific pose file for the specific avatar, and but it'll work. There may be one for couples poses, but you can generally get away with using the single avatar pose files to create your couples pose, because essentially that's all it is. That's all a couples pose is two avatar poses. Poses? Yeah, two avatar poses opposing each other, depending on what the pose actually is. So that's the alternative pose file. So we'll call it quits there. This was just a quick, that was an hour and a half overview of the alternative starter file for poses, male and female. Right, leave it there, and we shall see you on the next stream, when that is maybe Valentine's, don't know. See if we can do something for that. Right, on that note, cheerio.